Croeso I Llanelli. Welcome to Llanelli, the largest town in the county of Carmarthenshire. Located just over 10 miles to the northwest of Swansea, Llanelli is a busy urban settlement with a lengthy history. And on this walk around the town centre, we'll explore everything from the town's early history to its proud industrial heritage as one of the world's foremost producers of tin. While we'll also see a number of other intriguing landmarks, from the Grand Town Hall to an unusually dense collection of non-conformist chapels. And of course the eye-catching Plas Llanelli, touted as the finest Georgian-era building in all of Wales. All of that is to come as we take a walk around the heart of Llanelli on a beautiful sunny day. But we begin our walk looking up at the oldest building in the town centre, the Church of St. Elli. With a history dating back at least 1500 years, and very possibly even longer than that, this eye-catching church lends its name to the town of Llanelli, which translates from Welsh as the Church of St. Elli. At its oldest, the church that we see today is nearly 900 years old, the stone tower here dating all the way back to the 12th century, while much of the rest of the building is slightly newer, dating to the 15th century. Today, this place of worship serves as the parish church for the people of Llanelli, but once upon a time this was the site of a monastery, founded around 1500 years ago in the 5th or 6th century AD. This was a period known as the Age of Saints, when Christianity was spreading far and wide across Wales and the rest of Great Britain. And it's likely that the monastery which existed here was built to replace an even older pagan shrine that stood before it, possibly as long as 2,000 years ago, as Christian missionaries spread the word of their religion to the people living here. The leafy parish churchyard that exists in the modern day is a treasure trove of history right in the heart of Llanelli. Not only a reminder of the town's earliest origins thousands of years ago, but also a place that was visited many times in the 18th century by the preacher John Wesley, who was a leading figure of religious nonconformism at the time, a movement which eventually took hold stronger here in Llanelli than most other places in the country. As we take a look at the town's First World War memorial, we'll talk more about that unique part of Llanelli's history later on in our walk. But just here we find the grand Georgian-era townhouse known as Plas Llanelli, built more than 300 years ago in 1714. As we mentioned earlier, this is often touted as the finest Georgian building in all of Wales, as a near perfectly preserved example of a typical townhouse of the era, which was originally built as a residence for the local MP, Sir Thomas Stepney, who belonged to the wealthy Stepney family that owned vast swathes of land around Llanelli. John Wesley also stayed inside the house on a number of his visits to the town in the late 18th century. And today you can also take a look around the building's exquisitely preserved interior for yourself. The former townhouse now offering tours, a bistro, and numerous function rooms for local events. But while Plas Llanelli may be best known for its fetching Georgian appearance, recent archaeological surveys have discovered that the site on which it stands may have once been home to a large Tudor-era house, dating from the 16th century. An indication then of this town's lengthy history of pre-industrial settlement. However, when it comes to modern-day Llanelli, the vast majority of the town does date from the industrial era and after, with grand buildings like the Llanelli Library just here demonstrating the prosperity that this town experienced during the Industrial Revolution. This large public facility was originally built in 1857, although a few years later in 1864, its distinctive campanile tower was added, designed to give this Welsh town's public library the appearance of an elegant Italian palace. Elsewhere in the town centre, we'll find a number of beautiful late 19th century buildings that were built with the help of vast wealth which was pouring into Llanelli on the back of its thriving industrial portfolio. This one of a number of towns in South Wales which rose to prosperity at the time. But as we walk along the rather more modern Vaughan Street just here, let's take a quick look at a map of South Wales to see exactly where Llanelli is located. As we mentioned, this town is just over 10 miles to the northwest of Swansea, located on a heavily industrialised piece of Carmarthenshire coastline, directly across the water from the wild Gower Peninsula. That's right, Llanelli is actually a seaside town, with a large beach and huge coastal park located about a mile away from the town's central square here, which is overlooked by the grand facade of the town's main shopping centre. Inside, you'll find the St Elli shopping centre, as well as Llanelli's indoor marketplace, a traditional market hall that's home to a number of stalls selling goods of all sorts, 6 days a week. Of course, while the modern shopping centre may be a permanent venue for the town's market, Llanelli has been home to a street market for much, much longer, since as long ago as the 13th century in fact. We know from the church that people had already been living in Llanelli for a long time before then, but the founding of a market here, which was historically held on the central town square, turned Llanelli into an important centre of trade and commerce in the very southeast of what we now know as Carmarthenshire, but what was then the historic county of Dyfed. People came from all over the region to buy and sell goods at the market here in Llanelli, and over the centuries the town's streets soon became busy with stalls selling everything from fresh produce to livestock, textiles and metal products. Later on we'll walk down Market Street, where markets used to be held in the 20th century. But here we find ourselves strolling along Stepney Street, which as you might imagine takes its name from the influential Stepney family. The landowning family were major figures in the town until the 19th century, when Llanelli entered its heyday as a major centre of heavy industry. From then until the mid-20th century, heavy industry drove strong growth in Llanelli. Many of the buildings that surround us here on Stepney Street, for example, were built during that period. Although, like many industrial towns around the country, growth eventually became decline in the last decades of the 20th century. Although you will still find a number of factories surrounding the town today, much of Llanelli's historic industry has fallen away, and the shops and businesses of the town centre here have suffered as a result. But that doesn't mean you won't find some fascinating landmarks among the closed shopfronts. This building, for example, is known locally as Presby, because it was originally built as a Presbyterian church back in 1872. Though now closed, this is one of a number of Christian places of worship around Llanelli which don't belong to the Church in Wales, the largest Christian denomination in this country. In fact, around the end of the Second World War, there were as many as 22 non-conformist places of worship in this town, a symptom of more than a century of the non-conformist movement spreading far and wide across Wales, with Llanelli often regarded as one of its most important centres. After Wales was incorporated into England in the 16th century, most of its people worshipped at Church of England churches. But over the years, many Welsh people felt increasingly neglected by the Anglo-centric Church of England. In the 18th century, preachers began spreading the word of new forms of Christian worship that differed from the doctrine espoused by the Church of England. And by the 19th century, many new, Wales-specific churches had been established, with the majority of the population following a non-conformist church. So that's why we'll see so many different churches and chapels as we continue to walk Llanelli streets. Although here we find a dazzling white building that was once upon a time the town's cinema. Opened back in 1911, the Llanelli Cinema was one of the town's most luxurious venues at the time, with seating capacity for as many as 850 people. One of two cinemas in the bustling industrial town at the time of its opening, this exquisite picture palace was screening films to the people of Llanelli until it finally closed down in the 1970s, afterwards being briefly converted into a bingo club, and then from the year 2000 onwards, the York Palace pub that we know today. Stretching out just in front of the pub and former cinema, meanwhile, we find ourselves in the delightful Spring Gardens, a nice patch of green in a central location, between the town's main shopping streets and the larger Church Street, which is the main road through the heart of Llanelli. The Spring Gardens are surrounded by historic buildings on all sides, and just across the road here we find another large chapel, the Moriah Baptist Chapel, which dates from the 1870s, and when it was built, it stood as the 8th Baptist church in the centre of Llanelli. Bear in mind, at the time of the late 19th century, this town was only home to a few thousand people. But such a density of non-conformist places of worship spoke to the strength of the movement here in Llanelli. And as we've discussed, there are plenty more to be seen on the town streets today, as we continue our walk. However, while industrial-era Llanelli was indeed a hotbed of independent religious thought, this fast-growing town was also only just getting to grips with the modern world, as it transitioned from a more sparsely populated coastal market town to a major population centre. Up until the industrial era, the people who lived in Llanelli and the rest of southeast Carmarthenshire were simply governed by the local lords of Kidwelly, based at Kidwelly Castle, about 7 miles to the northwest of here. But as the town's population grew, this antiquated form of local government became inadequate for the people's needs. And during the 19th century, it was actually the local Board of Health which suddenly became responsible for administration of the whole town. However, just here, we find what became the heart of local government in Llanelli, the Grand Town Hall, which was built back in 1897, just a few years after the town's Victorian Health Board was taken over by a proper urban district council. Now before this, Llanelli's old town hall was located in a first-floor room on Hall Street near to the parish church. But as we admire the town's prominent Boer War memorial here, the new district council recognised the need for a larger, purpose-built facility in the heart of town. So the town hall that we see today was built here, on what had until the 1890s been a large area of open land. And as well as featuring some exquisite Victorian architecture, it was also surrounded by some lovely gardens, which are still very much open to the public today to enjoy. And they extend much further than just the area which we can see here. Surrounding the town hall here are some lovely landscaped gardens, complete with this fetching bandstand which dates all the way back to 1889. But just beyond these gardens you'll find the sprawling People's Park, which is home to sports pitches, playgrounds, large green spaces, a lake, and even the site of what's reputed to be Carnwillian Castle, Llanelli's old medieval castle. We won't quite have time to walk all the way to the site of the old castle, which is located on a small island in the middle of the park's tranquil lake, known as Pond Tuam. Of course, where the castle once stood, things wouldn't have been quite so tranquil here. In fact, it's likely that after Carnwillian Castle was built, sometime around the late 11th century, it was caught up in a number of large sieges and battles, mostly fought between the armies of Welsh princes and the Normans, who were sweeping across Wales after their earlier conquest of England. Accordingly, Llanelli's Carnwillian Castle was eventually burned down by the Welsh warrior Rhys Iwanc after a major siege in the year 1215, and sadly there are next to no physical remains of the castle to be found today. However, back here in the gardens surrounding the town hall, there are plenty more landmarks to take note of. Just here on the opposite side of the building from the Boer War Memorial, for example, we find the town's striking War Memorial, dedicated to all the locals who've lost their lives fighting in conflicts in the 20th and 21st centuries. Complete with an impressive sculpture of 2 infantrymen, this major war memorial is the centre of the town's remembrance services every year. But it's not the only military memorial that you'll find in the town hall gardens. Just beside the war memorial, and in the shadow of the town hall itself, we find a tree planted in memory of Company Sergeant Ivor Rees, who was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for bravery, for his role during the Third Battle of Ypres, in 1917, during the First World War. The story goes that Rhys single-handedly rushed towards and disabled an enemy machine gun in the trenches, which had been inflicting heavy damages on his Welsh division, and he helped to capture a large number of prisoners and prevent further casualties among his compatriots. So, as we've seen, there are plenty of things to see in Llanelli's delightful town hall gardens, and in the People's Park beyond. But it's time to make our way out of this lovely open space, and back out onto the town's streets. From here we'll make our way along Church Street, the main road through town which leads back towards St Elli's Church, and which passes by yet more of this town's vast collection of grand chapels. Just across the road here, for example, there stands the rather spectacular Tabernacle Chapel, which dates from 1872. This major congregational chapel was yet another that was constructed to provide more places of worship to this town's rapidly growing population. At the time, of course, the vast majority of people regularly attended religious services, so the presence of enough places of worship for the whole population was a real necessity in any modern industrial town like Llanelli. In all, there are more than 12 historic places of worship still standing on the streets of this town of roughly 25,000 people, some of which are no longer in use, and some of which are indeed still operating. Now, despite the presence of so many different religious denominations in just one town, there was generally little major conflict between the different local congregations, many of whom worked alongside one another in the town's tin and steel factories. We'll talk more about how much of an important role Llanelli played in tin and steel production in a short while. But among the wide variety of places of worship on the town's streets, there was one building which was open to cater to all of the people of Llanelli. This is the Parish Church Hall, opened all the way back in 1888 as a community centre for locals of all denominations. But this humble building on Church Street is actually best known today as the venue for a notable speech in the year 1912, given by the leading suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. As part of her campaign for women's right to vote, Pankhurst travelled to every corner of the country, and she made a speech here to a busy crowd at Llanelli's Parish Hall, although much of the crowd at the time was actually there to heckle what many saw as her controversial opinions. A large contingent of police were even brought into Llanelli and stationed on Church Street here, expecting the crowd to turn unruly. But fortunately no major incidents occurred on the day, with Pankhurst's speech said to have struck a chord with many of those listening on. Now, having made our way along Church Street, you'll recognise this part of town, St Elli's Church having historically marked the very heart of Llanelli. As we know, the church stands on the site of an early medieval monastery, which stood at the heart of what was then a tiny rural settlement. Meanwhile, just across the street from the church, the grand Plas Llanelli is another building which holds a window into the past beneath its floorboards. The archaeological digs that we mentioned earlier unearthing the legacy of a grand Tudor hall. But between the two historic buildings here, we're walking along Bridge Street, a name that tells us that there was once upon a time a major bridge located in this part of town. At the other end of the street from the church, a crossing known as the Falcon Bridge once spanned the local river Elli, which flows through the heart of this town. The bridge was once part of the main thoroughfare passing through Llanelli, but things changed when the river, beside which the town had grown up through the centuries, was eventually hidden away beneath the ground. The bridge, which was once situated just here, no longer serves a purpose, because while the Elli does still flow through central Llanelli, it does so within dark culverts under our feet just here, before it eventually pops out into the sunlight once again, just a short distance from the People's Park and the Town Hall. The covering of the river, likely carried out at some time in the 18th or 19th century, was an important step in the rise of industrial-era Llanelli, allowing for less restrictive urban development as more and more people began moving to work here. Now here we're walking along Market Street, today a fairly unassuming side road that was once upon a time the home of Llanelli's permanent open-air marketplace, lined with stalls selling all sorts of goods, and which was in use well into the late 20th century. Though it was demolished a couple of decades ago, the market had been standing ever since this town's industrial era heyday, when Llanelli stood at the forefront of a number of major heavy industries. Before the 19th century, the majority of people in Llanelli made their living in fishing, agriculture or coal mining. This town located just on the edge of a major coalfield covering a large part of South Wales. However, industrialisation here took a further step when a large number of metal factories were set up in the town. Initially, this was spearheaded by copper production. In fact, at the turn of the 19th century, as much as 90% of all of Britain's copper was produced in South Wales, and the main centre of copper production was here in Llanelli, after the wealthy copper magnate, Charles Neville, moved his business to this town. This led to an influx of people moving to Llanelli, hoping to find work in one of these factories. But it wasn't just copper that was made here. The vast coal deposits located near to the town were able to power large factories producing many more metals, most notably steel and tin. By the end of the 19th century, the production of tin plate had risen to become Llanelli's leading industry. In fact, as many as 5,000 people, a sizable chunk of the population, worked in local tin factories. Over 100 years ago then, Llanelli was one of the world's largest centres of tin plate production, so closely associated with the metal in fact, that the town was even nicknamed Tinopolis. Although it eventually declined in the post-war era, the legacy of Tinopolis remains strong to this day. And here we find a striking sculpture of 2013 known as Industrial Symphony, which pays tribute to Llanelli's thousands of tin workers. Now this sculpture stands at the end of Park Street, a reference to the famous Park Howard, which is situated in a grand Victorian estate that's located just to the north of the town centre. We won't quite have time to visit Park Howard today, but lining one side of Park Street here, we find one final collection of local religious buildings. This large building of 1913 being the town's former Baptist schoolroom, and beside it the historic Baptist chapel, which dates back to 1857. We know the story of how these chapels came to dominate Llanelli's streets. But just before we finish our walk, let's briefly explain one interesting quirk about the town, that its residents are nicknamed Turks. The origins of the Turk moniker are shrouded in mystery, but some say that the name comes from Llanelli's dock workers, who often received Turkish ships when those at nearby Swansea's dock would not. Llanelli's dock workers are even said to have once gone on strike in support of Turkish sailors who were receiving low wages, and so that could be why the locals of this Welsh town are known today as Turks. But that brings us to the end of our walk around Llanelli. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you're now looking forward to visiting for yourself sometime soon.